Subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee will begin its meeting today and receive testimony on the Department's chemical security regulations and its effect on the public and private sector. Let me thank this well-attended audience for their enormous courtesies. Part of the obligations of members cannot be done by proxy. Though I was in the Senate last week, and I think both the ranking member and myself were overwhelmed with the creativity of proxies that the Senate has the ability to utilize, but we don't use them here, and therefore we had a series of votes. We thank you for your indulgence and your courtesies, and Mr. Secretary, we thank you very much. You've been busy here with us over a number of weeks, and we thank you for your attentiveness. Let me, before I start, make a non-hearing and non-committee statement, but it is one that is the jurisdiction of this committee, and frankly, I'm going to put it on the record. I was appalled at the incident in Phoenix, Arizona. It is a homeland security matter, and it's a matter for this committee. There are several representations of cure that have been represented to this committee. But it will be my intent, and I know a number of members on the full committee are enormously involved in this issue and frankly have been proven right to secure a report on the nation's airports as relates to 24-hour, 7-day-a-week response as relates to employees across America. I think the incident bears on intolerable. And if there is any other incidences like this, it is this committee and the department that need to be fully aware and intervene immediately. This is no time for security gaffes like that to be occurring in this country. With that being said, this is an important meeting, Mr. Secretary, an important hearing. In the course of just a couple of weeks, I've heard from a number of constituents, many of whom are interested in how we can work together and realize that in the new climate that we now are exposed, now some 6 years after 9/11, and increased interest by those that would do us harm, that preparation and preparedness is key. They also recognize that the critical infrastructure aspect of this committee that involves chemical security facilities, most of it lodged in the private sector, there must be a partnership and there must be responsibility. So as I begin, let me again say there's been, however, a great deal of curiosity, even skepticism about how effectively the Department of Homeland Security could implement these regulations. As it has not had to do so in the past with regard to other sectors. I believe that because this is the Department's first attempt in a regulatory role, oversight is vital. As I've said, a large part of this sector is in the private sector. And I would hope that as they would question you, I hope they'll be questioning themselves so that they realize that none of these items are subject to games that we might tend to play. Whose side are you on? It is all about securing America. I believe that because this is the Department's first attempt in a regulatory role, we must be a partner in this, and that means this committee and the full committee. The committee must explore the chemical security regulations implemented by the Department. We have that responsibility under the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill of FY07. Specifically, the committee is interested in the top screen process, which, as you all know, is the initial phase of the regulatory requirements. We are concerned about the breadth of entities that will be required to fill out a top screen application and would like some clarifying answers on the Department's preparation for this process. There are many elements of this issue, and we welcome the panel's insight. First, we must know how the Department decided upon which chemicals to include and their amounts. Second, was the Department prepared for entities such as universities and small businesses to be subject to the top screen process? The committee needs to confirm that the Department has the necessary resources to perform these tasks and to thoughtfully and thoroughly review the questionnaires and assessment. We also need to know whether we've gone far enough, and there is a great deal of interest in writing a comprehensive chemical security bill. Why? I repeat it over and over again, 85% of the critical infrastructure, which includes chemical security or chemical plants are in the private sector. If the department is lacking resources or having problems, the committee must know, because chemical security is vital to our national security. In fact, in any discussions that have now been publicized, we know it is enormously vital. They are crucial, and their security, the entity's security, the people who work there, is crucial to the security of this nation. Even large companies, via the Chemical Sector Coordinating Council, have expressed concerns about the regulatory regime's approach. That is why this committee is holding hearings, and we're open to their concerns. But I personally am not open to countering or denying or undermining the security of this nation. The committee should discern how the department is defining risks, the methodologies it is using, why it is requiring facilities in the top 3 tiers to only use the department's vulnerability assessment and not the assessment that many companies already use. This duplication of resources seems especially perplexing. However, I am open-minded. I'm willing to listen to the reasoning behind it so that we can find common ground. There is no doubt that the private sector wants to be secure. They are Americans. And so there must be a common ground to be able to solve some of these questions that are being raised. Many advocacy groups, chemical companies, and state and local governments have expressed frustration about whether these regulations preempt state and local chemical security regulations, some of which happen to be better than the federal criteria and standards right now. The appropriations bill was silent on preemption, but nevertheless, the regulations seem to imply that the regulations will preempt state and local laws. Dow Chemical expressed to the committee that it is supportive of state and local laws that may be more forceful than the federal regulations. There are several circulating proposals to ensure that these regulations do not preempt state and local laws. In the Homeland Security Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2008, the House made clear that the department should not preempt state chemical security laws unless they're in direct conflict with the federal regulations. There are also concerns about the introduction of a new category of pseudo-classified information called Chemical Terrorism Vulnerability Information, or CVI. The department has created a multiple forms of classified information that may or may not be necessary and merely seem to confuse interested parties. Again, this is the time to make the case or clarify so that the ultimate goal is the security of all of us here in America, and particularly those physical plants dealing with chemicals that can be the genesis of a horrific terrorist act. In the Homeland Security Appropriations Act for FY 2008, language was included to instruct the department not to create a new class of protected information, but to use the Sensitive Security Information category, or SSI, already used for sites located at maritime ports regulated under the Maritime Transportation Security Act. In the area of worker protection and participation, we'd like to see protections provided for whistleblowers, as well as the inclusion of chemical security workers in creating the vulnerability assessments and the site security plans. It appears that workers are not included in this process, and their knowledge and position on the front lines would be very useful to create more effective regulations. I'm also interested, additionally, in training of these workers and criteria for training the workers, and whether or not that is part of a extended and coordinated practice. We also want to know how useful the Chemical Sector Coordinating Council and Chemical Sector Pacific Plan under the NIPP were in creating and implementing regulations. These regulations seem to provide a perfect opportunity to see a real-world example of how effective these plans and the councils are. As you can see, we have a lot to discuss. I, along with other members of the subcommittee, am seriously committed to protecting critical infrastructure and understanding how the private sector is protecting our vital assets. However, I'm not willing to leave it totally to the private sector or to the federal government alone. This committee, this full committee, the subcommittee must be intimately involved. As I've often said, the bottom line is that if a horrific act were to occur, the name that most would look to is the Homeland Security Department and the Homeland Security Committee. Again, today we want to explore what steps the private sector has taken to protect its infrastructure and the department's role in this process. We look forward to the witnesses' testimony and learning how these different entities protect themselves from threats and what role the Congress can play, and how we can fortify the relationship to protect the United States from a chemical attack. The chair is pleased now to recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from California, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee. Because of the crazy schedule going on today around here, I will have to unfortunately leave at 2:45, so I hope to hear as much as I possibly can from both panels. I must say it is fitting that our subcommittee be the first to review the Department of Homeland Security's efforts implementing our committee's bipartisan chemical security legislation, which was enacted just last year. The authority to regulate the chemical industry is indeed historic. For the first time, all chemical facilities will be assessed, top screen for potential consequences, and assigned to risk-based tiers because of specific security concerns. The department, as I understand, estimates that there are 40,000 facilities which will complete this assessment process. Those facilities which qualify as tiers 1, 2, or 3 will be required to conduct a facility vulnerability assessment and submit a site security plan to address those vulnerabilities. This is in keeping with the legislation which we enacted last year, where we were trying to ensure that we targeted our greatest resources at the greatest risks. I'm pleased that the regulations recently issued under our legislation were both risk-based and performance-based. I believe this will prevent us from overreaching and enacting inflexible and unreasonable requirements on our nation's chemical facilities. The last thing we want to do is to somehow suppress the ingenuity and creativity of the private sector in coming up with the necessary security measures. And I think we've avoided this so long as we have both risk-based and performance-based assessments guiding our conduct. Our goal and that of these regulations should be to strike the right balance between securing our high-risk chemical facilities while ensuring that they continue their vital service to the American economy. Reference was made by the chairwoman to legislation or language contained in legislation this year, which changes carefully constructed language that we had last year to try and establish a balance between the federal, state, and local governments. Last year, we came upon language which has been utilized by the courts before. I can't give you it exact, but I believe it is something to the effect that state and local laws, so long as they did not frustrate the federal intent or purpose, would be allowed. That language is language which has been utilized by the courts in the past to determine the relationship between, or excuse me, among the different levels of government, and I am concerned that the new language, if it's completed in legislation with the Senate, would cause us to have disputes in the courts as to what that language actually means. Unfortunately, it seems to me it is too early in this regulatory effort to make a full determination as to the success or failure of the department in implementing the regulatory scheme. To be fair, we should allow these regulations to be fully implemented before we second-guess their effectiveness. Nonetheless, I'm interested to hear from you, Colonel Stephan, on exactly what you've done, how you're going forward with it. Also from the second panel, I've not had the opportunity to meet the members of the panel, but I have familiarity with the Dow Chemical Company and one of their major plants in the previous district that I represented, and at that time, I recall that they were ahead of the curve on the question of safety and security, and I would look forward to hearing what they are doing in the present environment as well. Thank you very much.
Other members, and thank you, Mr. Lundgren, for your remarks. The chairwoman acknowledges that other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. And I would ask at this time unanimous consent that we would continue as if we had a quorum in the absence of Mr. Lundgren.
Objection.
Any objection? None being heard, we thank you very much so that we can complete this particular hearing. It's, again, a pleasure to welcome Colonel Robert Stephan. Colonel Stephan is the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Infrastructure Protection with the Department of Homeland Security, and prior to joining the department in 2005, Colonel Stephan was a Senior Director for Critical Infrastructure Protection in the Executive Office of the President. Colonel Stephan had a distinguished 24-year career with the Air Force. We welcome you. We have seen you quite frequently. We thank you for the important work that you've done on critical infrastructure, and we're very glad that you're here today, and we thank you for your military service. And so, without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted into the record, and we welcome you again. Thank you for your testimony.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Lungren, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today about an important topic, in fact, a topic that's very much at the center of our radar screen at the Department of Homeland Security and within my office in particular. I also wanted to thank you both personally for your leadership in bringing this legislative authority to life, this regulatory authority to life, and your continued support in ensuring the success of its implementation. As you know, securing the chemical sector represents an immense undertaking involving a national effort, including all levels of government, industry, multiple other organization entities, and the American public writ large. Integrated and effective partnerships among all stakeholders are essential to securing our national critical infrastructures, particularly including high-risk chemical facilities across the nation. The chemical sector has nearly 1 million employees and represents about $500 billion a year in revenue. It converts raw materials into more than 70,000 diverse products, many of which are critical to the health and well-being of our nation's citizens, to security, to the economy, to the lives of everyday Americans. The contribution the chemical sector makes to the nation are great, but they are certainly not without risk, as both of you have highlighted. Many chemicals, either in their base form or when combined with others, could cause significant harm to people and the environment if released or removed from a facility and weaponized in some fashion. Additionally, a terrorist attack or natural disaster could significantly disrupt production at key facilities, causing very important supply chain issues that could be harmful to the economy on a regional or national scale. The Department's vision for the chemical sector is an economically competitive industry with a sustainable security posture achieved using risk-based assessments, industry best practices, and a comprehensive information sharing environment between industry and government. This vision also includes recently the implementation of a tailored new regulatory authority, the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, more affectionately known as the CFATS, aimed at securing the most high-risk sites around the country. In a combination of voluntary industry efforts and risk-based public-private collaboration inside of regulatory space is what we're going to use to enable implementation of this overarching vision. As you all are well aware, our Appropriations Act language from last year directed us to develop and implement a regulatory framework for high-risk facilities in the chemical sector. The Act gives the DHS authority to require high-risk chemical plants to complete vulnerability assessments, develop site security plans, and implement protective measures necessary to meet performance-based standards. The Act gave DHS 6 months from the date the President signed the bill in early April 2007 to promulgate interim final regulations. DHS released these final regulations, the CFATS, on April 9th of this year. The following core principles guide the development of this regulatory framework: consultation with industry experts, academic specialists, engineering associations, and non-governmental organizations in a close public-private sector partnership. We've also leveraged state and local organizations such as the New Jersey State government at various levels and the New Jersey State Chemical Council to make sure we've effectively leveraged that vital partnership. Tiering: not all facilities represent the same level of risk, and the most scrutiny should be focused on those that, if attacked, of course, represent the most risk, and we should focus on complicating the lives of our terrorist adversaries in every single thing we do in this program. Performance standards should be reasonable, clear, and equitable, and achieve the balance that Congressman Lundgren spoke to in terms of achieving security while preserving the economic vitality and competitiveness of the industry. Finally, in implementing this regulation, we should recognize the very significant progress that multiple entities across the sector have made since the September 11th attacks to provide for their own security, as well as the many voluntary programs they have joined in partnership with DHS and other federal and state and local agencies to get the job done. In September of 2006, we released an advance notice of rulemaking that contained a draft regulation for public comment. Through this process, we received more than 1,300 pages of comments from over 106 separate submitters. We've extensively reviewed these comments and considered them in the final regulation. Inside the interim final rule, we included a second public comment period, and a very important piece that I'll like to go into more detail with you all during the Q&A session, specific to Appendix A, which details specific chemicals of concern and screening threshold quantities that we intend to regulate through this program. The comment period closed out in early May and produced more than 4,000 individual comments for our review. As the Secretary has noted, we are reviewing these comments very carefully and are closely consider them as we work to finalize the appendix. In fact, the internal DHS clearance process closed at noon today, Madam Chairwoman, I'm happy to report. And the final Appendix A should then be skirting its way through the OMB process in the coming weeks. Issues that informed our initial look at chemicals of concern in developing CFAS included toxic release quantities, potential for theft or diversion, potential for sabotage or contamination, and economic and government mission impact across the country. To implement and execute these regulations, DSH must, in a very complicated manner, define the regulated community or determine which facilities are high risk. To facilitate this process, we developed a screening tool called the Chemical Security Assessment Tool, or CSAT. CSAT employs an easy-to-use, kind of like TurboTax, online consequence-based top screen tool. CSAT builds upon the functional assessment tool developed by DHS with industry, earlier referred to as RAMCAP, or Risk Analysis and Management for Critical Asset Protection. Under the regulatory program, chemical facilities initially designated high risk must complete this online consequence assessment tool, and this information we will use to factor into the final tiering of the facilities. Using the results of the CSAT tools, all high-risk facilities will be placed into one of 4 tiers based upon risk. The higher facilities tier, the more robust measures they will need to incorporate, and the more frequent and rigorous their inspection cycles will be. Inspections will both validate the adequacy of a facility site security plan, as well as verify the implementation of the specific protective measures identified therein. DHS is using a phased approach, this is very important, to implementing the regulations, with implementation at the highest risk facilities beginning in an expedited manner and implementation at lower risk facilities occurring in a sequential fashion. On June 8th, the CSAT top screen went live and the Chemical Vulnerability Information Program went into effect. On June 11th, we reached out to the State Homeland Security Advisor Community and the Chemical and Natural Gas and Oil Government Coordinating Councils and their corresponding private sector counterparts to brief them fully on program implementation. We kicked off what we call Phase 1A the week of June 11th of implementation, making direct
Colonel,
calls.
are you wrapping up soon?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Making calls to approximately 50 select facilities to inform them of inclusion in an accelerated, fast-paced Phase 1 implementation. This outreach was at the corporate level and expected to result in a collaborative effort to complete the CSAT top screen in an expedited fashion. Ma'am, I have also other details regarding specific implementation steps and very important voluntary efforts such as the Chemical Comprehensive Review Plan program, Buffer Zone Protection Plan program, various types of information sharing programs and mechanisms, coordinating structures we've established for incident management that are all cataloged in very great detail inside my written testimony, and of course that is submitted for your review and comment. Ma'am, barring any further issues, I will then turn the floor over back to you for questions and answers on this very important topic. Again, I thank the leadership of this subcommittee for helping drive this process forward. We look forward to partnering with you as we begin to implement now this very, very complex regulation and make sure that we absolutely do the right thing. My people and I, we are no fail in terms of this mission, and you should have no concern about our ability to do this because we are the right people to do this task, and you have our pledge that we're going to do it the right way. We also understand we're not going to get a second chance to do this the right way, and so we're fully committed to doing this. Thank you again for your continued support as we move through this together.
Well, I'm sure, Colonel, that the nation is grateful for your enthusiasm. We know that the entirety of your statement, if there is more remaining, will be submitted into the record. We thank you for the passion in which you have presented your testimony. Frankly, I believe that is certainly the appropriate passion, if you will, because we're talking about some enormously dangerous possibilities, even if we have the attention as we do of the industry. Let me, for any members coming, let me remind, for the record, remind those members that may be on their way because of this busy schedule, that each will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And at this time, I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Allow me quickly, Colonel, if I can, and if your questions can be pointed, if you will, because I do want to get to the second panel respecting the ranking member's schedule that may require him to leave. We will have a further opportunity to explore this because we're not finished with this one hearing. You noted, as I spoke earlier in my remarks, that the fundamental approach and structure of the chemical regulations is one that we have, in fact, worked with you on based upon legislation this session and legislation in the past Congress. And so we think the approach certainly has the right tone to it, the right direction. But we also raised the question about the implementation, especially the top screen process. So tell us quickly what process was used to determine chemicals of concern. That is a key element. What process was used to calculate the respective amounts that determine whether an entity is required to conduct a top screen?
Yes, ma'am. Quickly, we're looking at classifying chemicals as substance of concern for purpose of this regulation based upon whether they are toxic by inhalation, release hazard, whether they're a theft, diversion, sabotage type issue. That is, can some material that we define as a substance of concern be removed from the site, weaponized into an IED configuration and used to kill people, or can it be used to sabotage or contaminate a public gathering place? Also, we're taking a look at a very interesting piece of new ground, that is the impact of individual facilities and chemicals on national and regional economic production, as well as national security and national or mission governance. All of the chemicals on the list were derived principally from existing sources, things that have gone through the test of time. They've been put in place by other safety regulators, principally such as the EPA, the Department of Transportation, the Transportation Security Administration, the Department of Commerce under the Chemical Weapons Convention.
So you took existing information and filtered it and came up with your list?
Principally, ma'am, although there are some chemicals on the list that probably don't exist on any existing list that might.
And do you have scientists under your jurisdiction to be able to assist you in further determinations?
Yes, ma'am. Through the Directorate of Science and Technology, we have a Chemical Security Analysis Center that's located slightly north.
And have you utilized that
Yes, ma'am.
research?
They've been fully engaged in the process with us, as has been the FBI's Weapon of Mass Destruction Lab and other scientific communities.
Is the list a growing list, a list to be modified, a list to be enhanced, a list to be detracted from?
Ma'am, it's approximately 300 plus chemicals in nature right now, and we're at, I think, with this phase of the program, submitting this to our secretary for his look this week, and I think from my perspective it's done.
And are chemicals on there that by themselves may be non-threatening, but in combination they are threatening?
That's correct, ma'am, in a mixture type environment.
Okay. Let me, you know that as you've heard from several entities, we've heard from several entities, including associations that represent universities. When we look at your materials in the top screen survey, you query respondents about their type of facility, and you give them the options to be called the chemical manufacturer, petroleum refinery, liquid natural gas facility. It seems as if that is what you're connecting to, but we're told that out of the procedures that we have, that we are a far more expansive scope, which would include universities. Are you surprised by the number and scope of the facilities that you're including? How are you addressing that question? And do you think at this present time you have enough staff to begin what will be an ongoing and extended process as these particular entities, facilities, have to come under these regulations?
Yes, ma'am. When you take the approach to regulate by chemical of concern, obviously we have found out, we knew initially there will be a more expansive universe than the traditional big chemical plant storage manufacturing facilities that would be included in this framework. Probably, to be honest with you, quite a bit more than we thought we would catch in the initial casting of the net. For those organizations that don't clearly fit into any one of the conventional chemical facility categories, such as the universities and colleges, we have established incredible outreach with these folks to figure out what their business landscape is, their operating environment, and their risk environment. And we have reached conclusions based upon our initial threshold quantities, as well as some of those that will ultimately fall inside our program authority, how we will work with them to develop some very specialized and tailored security plans. Ma'am, we have, as you know, that with the passage of this act, I was not given initially any new resources to conduct this mission. I recently, as I think about a week ago, was able to tap into the $12 million supplemental appropriation to be able to bring this program up to speed for the where we think it needs to go in 07. 08, you will see an increase in the department's requirements over the 07 threshold. I have recently, with the finalization of the interim final rule, conducted a very comprehensive 2-month-long manpower and resources required study that I'm now using inside my chain of command to take a look at budget formulation for the out years.
But these expanded groups, you feel prepared to deal with the expanded groups beyond chemical manufacturing, liquid natural gas facilities?
Yes,
All the large fishnet that you have, you're prepared to deal with those various organizations, universities, and others?
Yes, ma'am, but again, we're going to be skinnying down the initial number of fish that we caught in the first nets that we cast based upon dialogue, listening sessions that we had with various elements of these new folks.
Well,
that are
I'd like
coming
you to
into
keep the
framework.
committee advised and like to be engaged in that process just to get an understanding of the direction which you're taking.
Yes, ma'am. And
Let me quickly, because my time is up, let me just ask you quickly, do you plan to use contractors to review the top screen questionnaires, dealing with the vulnerability assessments, site security plans, and to conduct site visits?
Ma'am, I plan to use a combination of federal employees, federal leadership, and some elements of contract staff to conduct the various aspects of the implementation of this regulation. I would be happy to get back with you in more specific detail based upon the knowledge base I have now.
And you have a sufficient number, census number of staff on that would partner with contract employees that are under your jurisdiction. That means they're cited at Homeland Security? They're on site?
Ma'am, I have people on site, and I also have 40 detailees from the Federal Protective Service on board that are stationed in places.
Right, but
across the
those
United
are
States.
federal government workers.
Yes, ma'am.
And
They
I'm
will be doing the on-site inspections.
not contractors that you've hired randomly.
Well, ma'am, I don't hire contractors randomly, but during some phase of...
Sometimes Homeland Security does hire people randomly. We see that all the time.
Okay, ma'am, I will not argue that point before you today. As we published in the IFR, the department is also contemplating for the lower tiers of the 1 through 4 tier structure, taking a look at a third-party auditor plan so that we can distribute some of the costs and the expertise to execute this mission across more population than my office represents at this point in time. That will be a separate rule-making process open for public comment, of course.
We will explore the staffing with you further. With that, let me yield back my time and yield to the distinguished gentleman from California for his questioning of the witness.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colonel, I remember when you first came into this position, you were required to put your stamp of approval on the sector-specific plans. At that time, you related to the committee that you were not satisfied with the quality of the product and asked for additional time. You have now reported to us on those 17 sector-specific plans, including that for the chemical industry. Can you give me an idea of the difference in approach that was used in this particular assignment with respect to the carrying out the authorization that you received last year on the chemical plants versus the sector-specific plans? You found you put a different approach to the sector-specific plans from what had been there before. How did you make sure that you didn't run into the same problems here that the department had run into before?
Well, sir, first and foremost, we established a coordinating structure through the sector coordinating councils and the government coordinating councils to make sure I had the right guys at the table. The Secretary gave us the 871 authority to put a protected legal umbrella or framework so that I could have protective security discussions with elements of the private sector. And then every single thing that we've developed on the voluntary side of the House has been in full collaboration with as many aspects of the chemical sector as wanted to come to our table and join us to help us work our way through and sort out some very tough policy decisions, planning decisions, and risk analysis related decisions. We are using that voluntary collaborative framework that has been in place for now 4.5 years as something that's achieved some, I think, pretty significant progress across the country in terms of the security of this sector, and are now parachuting on top of that some very surgically applied regulatory authority to those places that need more attention, and then I need to be able to look you in the eye and guarantee you more their level of security than I can today.
Let me ask you about that. From your written testimony, it is your position that the top screen process will provide you with essential information necessary to locate and secure the high-risk chemical facilities. This is information that the department has never had before, nor had the authority to request before, correct?
Yes, sir, we did not have the authority, and this will be an amazing set of very sensitive proprietary and security-related information that gets not just vulnerabilities, but consequences and vulnerabilities in the context of very specific threat vectors.
Because it includes proprietary information and information that one company may not want to share with another or would not want to get out into the public domain because of the security, how do you assure the participants of the security of the information?
So because we have developed a new program, I know it's not popular to develop a new information sharing program, but because of the requirements of the mandates in Section 550 of our Appropriations Act to basically treat this information as if it were classified information in the context of enforcement, and the amount of collaboration that we agree with 100% that is required between us and our state and local government partners and the emergency responder community and the law enforcement community across these jurisdictions that house these chemical plants, there's going to be a lot of people that by mandate now have potential access to this information. I've got to be able to look these private sector folks in the eye and guarantee from a proprietary perspective and from a security perspective that we have a very special regime in place that will not allow that information to be leaked in any way, and that we're working out a process through Colonel Mike McDaniel, the State Homeland Security Advisor from Michigan, and about 30 other folks that represent the first responder, law enforcement, and emergency management communities around the country. What is the exact protocol in writing, an MOU that we will work out with each state that will house a CFATS regulated facility to very clearly understand that that information is protected. I think
What's the level of confidence that you have achieved with the private sector in that?
So I think that we're in the initial stages of working the state and local piece with the private sector. I think the private sector is very comfortable now with the CVI, the Chemical Vulnerability Information Guidelines that we published about a month and a half ago. And I can say that in a similar framework on a voluntary side of the House, the Protected Critical Infrastructure Information Program, in 4 years now, we have not had a single leak of one bit of data into the public at large from that program. So
to what extent, if any, do the chemical regulations take into account the transportation of the chemicals? That is, it's extremely important that we worry about the security of the chemicals at a site, but what about going from site to site?
So inside the CFATS Regulatory Authority, which is basically my baby, we have specific performance standards that address the receipt of and dispatch of chemical substance of concern in and out of the facility, and to make sure that terminal process is secure. A companion or sister regulation, as you know, is in the works and was submitted very recently into final clearance at the department level that's under the leadership of the Transportation Security Administration, and that will basically govern the entire supply chain piece outside of fixed facilities for transportation security.
Have you two folks, two groups, been talking to one another within DHS?
We have exchanged hostages on each other's working groups, and we have prisoners of war protocols and everything established, and I think that process is going very well. Our job here is to eliminate any potential seams, and I've seen those seams at chemical plants that I visited, and that is the #1 focus on my part, to make sure that we have no seams that can be exploited between those two regimes.
Have the folks working on the transportation side had an opportunity, or some of them, to look at what you're doing and vice versa?
Yes, sir. And that same comment applies with respect to the United States Coast Guard and the MITSA program.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Let me, Mr. Secretary, thank you, and I will be posing this question very quickly so that we can move to the second panel. And as we recognize Mr. Markey's presence here, and we'll yield to him in a moment, let me ask this question that I will pose to the other witnesses. We know that we came together, Republicans and Democrats, because chemical plants are vulnerable to terrorism. As you sit here today, we're in a work in progress, but if you had to make an assessment of the progress that these regulations have made in thwarting, blocking potential terrorist acts against the nation's chemical plants, housed mostly in the hands of the private sector, where are we, what scale are we on with respect to securing America? That can obviously be talked generically as opposed to any classified information. How comfortable do you feel as it relates to whether or not we're making progress in terms of thwarting potential terrorist acts against these facilities?
Ma'am, I think we're making considerable progress, but again, this regulatory framework has been alive for basically a month and a half. So in terms of progress I can specifically tie to this specific framework, we're going to have to let a little bit more time run its course. If you couple what we're doing now and the collaboration we've achieved in implementing this thing at the beginning with all the voluntary measures we put in place, for example, right now on some of the top 394 facilities on the EPA's RMP database list, I have buffer zone plans and to the tune of financing of $68 million, which is the largest single contribution to any one of the infrastructure sectors under my control. We have pushed out planning that has tied state and local law enforcement and emergency responder capacity to the security capacity of the plants themselves, achieving inside and outside the fence synergy. Based upon 4.5 years of voluntary security work with the industry, I feel we know them, they know us. We have a solid voluntary structure in place, information sharing mechanisms in place, grant monies that's been targeted to the weakest links in the process based on consequences. And now we're ready to move again to the next level on the cake, which is the Security Regulatory Authority.
Let me thank you. Let me yield to the distinguished gentleman from New York for, from Massachusetts for 5 minutes, Mr. Markey. No, he doesn't. He said, don't ever. And folks, let me clarify that. He's not talking about New York. He just said, don't call him a Yankee fan. And I appreciate his dilemma. Mr. Markey for 5 minutes.
in California have occurred. And as you know, cylinders of this size could pose a significant risk to the lives of everyone exposed to their contents. Chairman Thompson and Langevin and Solis and I sent a letter to Secretary Chertoff requesting more information on this. Although your department has yet to respond to our letter, an article in today's Boston Globe indicates that the theft remain unsolved and that there has been at least one additional theft of a chlorine cylinder in Texas since then. As you know, the law that Congress passed last year exempted water treatment facilities from regulation by the Department of Homeland Security. Don't you think it's time, Colonel, for us to withdraw that exemption so the Department of Security can move into an area where we know Al-Qaeda is trying to obtain chlorine that could cause a catastrophic event here in the United States?
Sir, I will take back your request to the Secretary. I've seen a signed letter from the Secretary to you, sir, and I will go back and try to figure out where that might be in the process to make sure you get that expeditiously.
I'm sorry, you've seen a signed letter to
Yes,
what effect?
Yes, sir, that with Secretary Chertoff's signature that answers your letter to him, sir. I will go back and see where that is in the process between the other side of Washington and here, and make sure you get prompt delivery. Also, I think I'd like to recognize—
Is there any reason for me to believe that the Secretary has changed his mind, that the Department of Homeland Security should not have jurisdiction over this issue, and that chlorine should sit out there as a threat to the American public, but without Department of Homeland Security responsibility for that issue?
So let me paraphrase the Secretary's response back to you in that the Secretary recognizes that this exemption has caused a gap in terms of regulatory authority for similar types of chemicals, similar types of facilities between the chemical sector, which we do regulate now under CFATS, and the water and, importantly, the wastewater sectors, that there is an imbalance in regulatory authority and hence a security gap. There are a couple—
Well, it's a regulatory black hole through which Al-Qaeda could drive a truck loaded with chlorine into a populated area of our country. Yes, I do agree with you on that.
So
but I have yet to hear a request from the Bush administration as to how we're going to close down this opening that al-Qaeda could exploit using chlorine.
So that security gap is acknowledged. There are many ways to kind of skin that gap in a colloquialism, or skin that cat.
Does the Secretary support or oppose the closing of this chlorine loophole that was created in the law last year?
He supports closing of the security-related gap that loophole has produced. There are several ways to do that. Those different ways are within discussion inside the administration at this point.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading this letter, but I'm willing to bet anything that your response is not going to be accurate. That is, that the Secretary is not going to call for a closing of this exemption. I don't have any evidence thus far, and I think this hearing might have prompted somebody to start writing a letter. You would have thought that I would have gotten it before the hearing. I think your answer to me is one that allows for an ambiguity to be kept until after this hearing so that you don't have to be held accountable for it. How do you close a security gap without changing the law? How are you going to do that?
Sir, you've got to give somebody authority. There's a combination of voluntary measures that could be put in place. There's lots of ways.
You're talking about giving the chlorine industry, you're saying let's give voluntary supervisory powers to an industry that has seen massive theft of this very product item that can be used by al-Qaeda for a terrorist attack. And I don't think that makes any sense, to trust the industry that has not been securing these materials. Why can't we have the Department of Homeland Security step up and say it's time for the Bush administration to provide supervision and stop trusting an industry that has demonstrated an incapacity to, in fact, deserve that trust?
Sir, in the letter from the Secretary to you, he is quite emphatic about his desire to close this security gap.
Is one of the things that are under consideration in the administration requiring the industry to use safer materials, that is, to use substitutes for chlorine? Is that one of the things that are under consideration?
So that particular issue is not a piece of the pie that is under consideration at that point.
Well, I think that's what ultimately the solution is to use safer chemicals that can't be used for terrorist purposes where possible. And it's just another thing that the Bush administration, unfortunately, has continued to defer to the industry rather than to the safety of the American public.
Would the gentleman yield on that?
I'd be glad to yield.
As I recall, when we were coming up,
Oh, I'm sorry.
The gentleman an additional 2 minutes.
Through the indulgence of the chair, I would be glad to.
when we were negotiating this last year, it was not the administration that asked for the removal of that portion of the sector, but it was the Senate that insisted upon it. I would just tell the gentleman. So when we were working on it on the House side, we didn't have that exception. For some reason, the Senate thought it was important. So just so the record would reflect, I do not recall the administration pushing that on us when we negotiated it last year. And I thank the gentleman for
I thank the gentleman, and I guess what I would wish here, now that we're in Democratic control in the House and the Senate, that if the Secretary does want this law changed, does want the power, that we're ready, willing, and able to now do it for the Secretary. But we have to hear from the Secretary that he wants to be able now to have the responsibility for making sure that we do not have a chlorine cylinder explode in a way that causes a catastrophic event in this country. And so if you could take that back to the Secretary.
Sir, I would be happy to deliver the message. Thank you.
I thank you.
The gentleman would just yield on his point. We are here today listening to industry as well on the impact of these regulations. I've indicated that I remain open but concerned about any lists that are going to be altered with removal of chemicals versus addition, inasmuch as each chemical, if you will, quantity has some possibility of creating a value for terrorists. And I think what you're saying is the question regarding chlorine, but there are many others that are seemingly being asked to be moved off the list. I hope the Secretary takes my concern back about moving list, taking different chemicals off of lists. And I know I've raised the question about universities, and we're going to move to the second panel. So we will have to continue this with you as this committee proceeds in the review of these chemical regulations. Let me thank you for your testimony.
Madam Chair, I thank you for your indulgence.
And thank you for your indulgence on my having you yield on your time. Thank you very much. I thank the witness for his cooperation, his wisdom in his statement, and we will look forward to working with you on the questions that have been raised by the members of this committee.
Thank you very much for your continued leadership and support of our programs.
Thank you, Colonel, very much. For the second panel. Let me thank the second panel again for your patience and welcome to this committee. We believe your testimony will be very instructive for a committee that has vast responsibilities on the nation's critical infrastructure. At this time, we'd like to welcome the second panel of witnesses. Our first witness will be Mr. Philip J. Crowley, Senior Fellow and Director for Homeland Security. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Crowley was Special Assistant to the President of the United States for National Security Affairs, serving as Senior Director of Public Affairs for the National Security Council. Prior to that, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. In all, Crowley was a spokesperson for the United States government and United States military for 28 years, 11 of those years at the Pentagon and 3 at the White House. Welcome, Mr. Crowley. Our second witness is Mr. Timothy Scott. Mr. Scott is Chief Security Officer and Global Director of Emergency Services and Security for Dow. In this capacity, Mr. Scott is responsible for security crisis management and emergency planning, preparation and response for on and off-site emergencies involving Dow or Dow products. Mr. Scott, we welcome you and we thank you very much for your presence here today. Our third witness is Mr. John Alexander with the United Steelworkers Health, Safety and Environment Department. He is here to give us a frontline perspective on chemical security, and we welcome you, Mr. Alexander. Our final witness of the panel is Dr. Ira Tahmassian. Dr. Tahmassian is representing the higher education organizations and is the Associate Vice President for Research and Compliance at the Boston University and Boston Medical Center, where he has responsibility for all non-financial research compliance issues. He has responsibility for preparation and implementation of integration strategies for multiple of regulatory compliance programs at Charles River Campus, Boston University Medical Campus, and Boston Medical Center, as well development new programs, as well as being involved in developing new programs required by the research enterprise. Welcome again to you, Doctor, and thank you for your presence here today. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record, and I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Crowley.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. I now direct the Homeland Security Program at the Center for American Progress, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to reflect on the emerging direction of chemical security regulation, and I commend the committee for coming back to this issue early in this process. More has been done in the last 10 months than the previous 5 years, a sign that we now recognize, if belatedly, that chemical security is our most significant infrastructure-related homeland security vulnerability. The new framework is a reasonable start, but more can be done, as a prior panel discussed. The threat is real, not hypothetical. The conclusions of the National Intelligence Estimate released last week are sobering. Iraq has become a deadly laboratory, and we have seen several attacks where al-Qaeda has used chlorine gas tanker trucks as makeshift weapons. If it is happening there, it can happen here. Our vulnerability is clear. The previous emphasis on voluntary steps did not work. While some may have made security investments, there remain today too many open gates, accessible storage containers, and unguarded rail sidings. A hazmat car moving through a major population center provides everything an urban terrorist would want: a weapon, delivery system, and target, all in one place. A successful attack would produce loss of life and injury that would dwarf what occurred on 9/11. First of all, I support what appears to be a very ambitious top screen process by DHS. Sound judgments require as much information and as broad a perspective as possible. The mere fact that DHS will evaluate a wide range of chemical manufacturers and users should serve as an important catalyst for change. The last thing we should do is narrow its potential impact. At a recent conference, a senior executive of a Fortune 500 company suggested that while security was important to his corporate leadership today, he could not guarantee it would remain so. Studies by our Center for American Progress echo this reality. Actions that improve chemical security are feasible and affordable, but the pace of change is inadequate. The real issue is what DHS will do based on the top screen. The purpose of government regulation is to broadly impact both perception and behavior to further a common good. The near-term objective should be to use the interim authority that Congress has granted to achieve the maximum possible impact. One way to do this is for DHS to take a system-wide approach to chemical security, as we do for maritime security. DHS should assess risk along a facility's supply chain, not just what occurs inside its fence line. The highest point of risk may be a hazmat car on a freight line that runs through a major city, like Washington, D.C., not far from where we're seated. DHS oversight can create a dynamic that brings the chemical and rail industries together to figure out how not just to manage risk, but actually reduce it. Third, we must ensure that DHS has the capacity to properly implement this new authority. In a conference call in April, DHS officials acknowledged that implementation would be handled by a staff of 33 people at headquarters and the 40 field representatives that Secretary Stephan mentioned in his testimony, despite the fact that the DHS top screen could involve tens of thousands of chemical facilities. Recall that the Coast Guard, one of the largest entities within the department, struggled with implementation of the Maritime Transportation Security Act, even when employing its Coast Guard auxiliary to help review port facility security plans. An industry of third-party auditors can help with enactment, compliance, and enforcement, but DHS cannot watch from the sidelines. It must be in the game and directly engaged. Fourth, DHS should set an aggressive implementation timeline. We must keep in mind that DHS will be undergoing its first presidential transition in late 2008. Congress should request a report including lessons learned and recommendations for permanent legislation from the current DHS leadership by the fall of next year to ensure continuity. Finally, Congress should pass legislation not later than early 2009 that establishes a permanent regulatory framework. A good model is the comprehensive, cross-jurisdictional approach that the House followed with legislation implementing the 9/11 Commission recommendations. This legislation should broaden DHS's authority in concert with the EPA to regulate drinking water and water treatment facilities, which are now exempted. It should combine physical security and transportation policies into a comprehensive strategy. It should establish material or process substitution as a key component of a successful security program. The legislation should make clear that federal regulation is a floor, not a ceiling. There is simply no reason that the federal government should preempt states from taking additional measures that can make specific sites even more secure. I thank the chairwoman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Mr. Scott, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, Honorable Chairwoman. Thank you for the invitation to address your committee on the critical issue of chemical security. My name is Tim Scott, and I'm the Chief Security Officer for Dow Chemical, the world's largest chemical company. I also have a dual role as a site leader for emergency services and security at Dow's site in Freeport, Texas, our largest manufacturing site and one of the largest in the world. Dow's products are essential to our nation's economy and the daily lives of every American. The chemical sector is not only a part of our nation's critical infrastructure, but the foundation for all other sectors. I have 3 key points today. First, a comprehensive, uniform, and risk-based approach to chemical security is critical. Second, effective partnerships are vital to our nation's success in meeting this challenge. And third, while there are still some gaps to resolve, the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards are a significant step forward in securing the chemical sector. Dow believes the most effective way to address chemical security is through a comprehensive, risk-based approach, and we developed our integrated global security processes that you see on this poster behind me with just that in mind. Dow has focused on security for years, but over the last 5 years we've conducted 2 rounds of vulnerability assessments at our sites around the world, conducted by teams of security professionals and process safety engineers and involving site employees at all levels at every site. We've applied layers of physical security along with technology and trained people around those critical assets to detect, deter, delay, and respond to intruders. We also implement inherently safer approaches when they prove to be an effective solution to change the way our products are manufactured, stored, or transported. We have programs in place to verify the backgrounds of our people working in our sites. We have hotlines for those who work on our sites, as well as the communities around us, to connect immediately with my global organization. And we have an ethics line for anyone to report, anonymously if they choose, any concerns, security issues, or suspicious situations they may see. Our integrated approach to security includes securing our supply chain, a responsibility we share with suppliers, carriers, customers, and government agencies. While less than 1% of what we ship is classified as highly hazardous, we have aggressive programs to further reduce inventories and the amounts we ship. In addition, we require security seals on shipping containers. We use advanced track and trace technologies. We work with carriers on routing solutions. We're developing more robust next-generation rail cars, and we're strengthening local awareness and response along our transportation routes. Partnerships on all levels are vital, and we are actively engaging federal agencies, congressional committees, and state and local agencies and emergency responders. In short, Dow Chemical is serious about security. We believe any facility that manufactures, uses, or possesses materials in hazardous quantities should be required to implement risk-based security measures. We are encouraged by the new standards and believe they are a significant step forward. We believe states have a critical role to play and may also have unique security issues, and we support the states' rights to address those gaps through a coordinated effort with federal authorities to ensure that conflict will not occur. We support the stated purpose of Appendix A and the top screen approach. However, we're encouraged the numbers of facilities potentially covered will be prioritized so that DHS can maintain its intended focus on high-risk facilities. We have concern that the sunset clause and the perceived deadlines that it creates will hamper the ability to implement effective standards. We support DHS's efforts and ask that adequate time be allowed for effective implementation. We've made a lot of progress, but more needs to be done. We need a comprehensive, uniform, and risk-based approach to protect our nation's people, communities, and critical infrastructure. We need a continued partnership to develop a consistent and efficient approach to this challenge. We need to build on the progress we've already made to be successful in strengthening the security of the chemical sector. And we need this coordinated effort now. We're encouraged by the leadership of your committee and Congress in general, the partnership developed by DHS, and the commitment to effective chemical security standards. Thank you.
Mr. Alexander.
I'd like to thank Chairwoman Jackson Lee and the committee for allowing the steelworkers to share their concerns about the chemical security regulations. The first item that I wanted to bring up was worker involvement. The current proposals do not provide for involvement by workers or their labor representatives, in contrast with other similar regulations also aimed at public safety. We believe that such involvement is essential to chemical plant security. Anyone who's worked in a chemical plant knows that the workers know better than anyone where the weaknesses are and what needs to be addressed in order to make a facility safer, and not to, in this particular piece of legislation or regulation, not to include the workers, we believe is a very big mistake. If you check just some of the other regulations that already exist, for the most part, they do have clauses in there that require worker participation in addressing those problems. The top screen process, we made some recommendations in the first round that they have a list of chemicals in order to figure out how they were going to use the top screen process, and we were glad to see that the Department of Homeland Security adopted that type of a process in order to make the determination who would have to complete it. But by the same token, now we look at the list, we have over 100 chemicals that if you have any amount whatsoever will require top screen process. And we have to question how much of a strain that's going to put on the Department of Homeland Security for facilities that have those chemicals, some of those chemicals that will serve as no risk whatsoever. And at the same time, we have chlorine listed at 7,500 pounds. Anything under 7,500 pounds would not have to complete a top screen process, and we have to just question where and how they came up with some of the list of the chemicals. The risk assessment and risk-based tiering, we're wondering why we have to have 4 different tiers. In the regulations, it reads what the highest risk process, what would have to be required that those companies complete. And if you read that list, there's nothing in that list that the lowest tiered facility should not be doing. So we don't understand why you need so many different tiers. Either you got a high risk, a low risk, or no risk. And you need to make it pretty simple. Why make it complicated? It's a pretty simple thing. You don't need extra tiers to complicate the issue. And we don't understand why we're going the way we're going. If you have a low risk, you obviously ought to be doing the same thing you're doing at high-risk facilities as far as security and so forth and so on in the list. Safer technology, inherently safer technology. We can't understand in any way, shape, or form why inherently safer technology is not at least a recommendation, let alone a requirement in these regulations. The easiest and safest way to take a facility that is a high-risk threat to turn it into not a threat would be to use inherently safer technologies. So that's not just chemical substitution, but also when you change your processes for emergency shutdown. You hit one button, it closes all your valves on the system so that if there is an attack and if there is a release, you can shut the whole system down almost instantly so that it doesn't turn into a larger catastrophic event. Our relief systems are probably 20 to 30% of the facilities in the nation. We had a lot of laws passed in late 70s and early 80s that the relief systems, the chemical facilities would have to have their relief systems go to a controlled atmosphere rather than the atmosphere. But a lot of the companies chose not to do that because it wasn't feasible. It would cost too much money. That's inherently safer technologies. If you want to reduce the damage that would be done if there was an attack, then you should have release systems going to controlled systems, which you don't. Background checks, the background checks, I have already, just a few months ago when I was investigating a fatality at a power plant, been refused entry because of the new, quote, what I was told, the new regulations on from the Department of Homeland Security that would not allow me entry because I didn't have a background check. I'm guaranteed entry by the National Labor Relations Act, and there is nothing in these regulations that protect our guarantees or rights that we already have, and already we're being denied entry into facilities where we're required to conduct investigations when workers are seriously injured or killed. There's access to information. Another issue, there's nothing in the regulation that protects our rights to access to information. If you read everything that's written on critical vulnerable information, depending on whose interpretation of what it is, could include information that we are allowed and permitted to have to protect workers, the community, and other folks that might, even the management, the plants, to protect the people that could be overexposed. And critical vulnerable information can deny us those rights. There should be something written in here that in no way any of our rights that are guaranteed by OSHA, the EPA, or any other agency be denied because of the Department of Homeland Security regulation. There's much more in-depth information in the written testimony that I submitted, and I would hope that everyone on the committee take a look at it. And just in summary, what I'd like to say is some of the most fundamental protections that one would expect to be identified in the Department of Homeland Security regulations are missing. The involvement of workers and their representatives in all aspects should be there. The use of inherently safer technology, the ambiguity of terms, the unwarranted background checks, and the possible classification of information used to protect workers and the public, and the lack of the government accountability on all those issues beg to be addressed. One last thing on the background checks. I don't understand what anyone would hope to find on an employee who's been working at a facility for 20 years and conducting a background check that's going to identify them as a terrorist.
I will pose those questions to you, Mr. Alexander. Your time has expired. Thank you. We'll put your statement into the record.
Okay.
Mr. Tahmassian, thank you for your presence here. Hope that we've given some corrected pronunciation to your name. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair.
Welcome.
Thank you. I would like to thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and the committee for allowing the opportunity to appear today. I'm here today representing the higher education associations and over 2,000 colleges and universities as its membership. I am in real life Associate Vice President for Research Compliance at Boston University and Boston Medical Center, where I have responsibility for research compliance, including safety and security, at over 600 labs spread over 25 buildings. There are three main points that I would like to highlight for you today. First is the commitment that the higher education has to continue to comply with the new chemical standards. The second, I would like to convey to you the concerns of colleges and universities about the standards that were published in April of 2007. And finally, I would like to emphasize that we are encouraged with how the Department of Homeland Security has responded to some of our concerns. First, I wish to make it clear to the committee that colleges and universities are committed to safe conduct of research and teaching on their campuses. We recognize that all of us, including colleges and universities, must become more vigilant in the post-September 11th world. Universities have for years complied with an evolving set of federal regulations governing health, safety, and security from OSHA, the CDC, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Agriculture, and Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to name a few. To meet these requirements, our institutions have assessed the risk of chemicals used on campus labs and have adopted appropriate safety measures for the protection of researchers and the environment. We will approach the Department of Homeland Security chemical standard with the same commitment to compliance. Having said that, we hope that we can work with the Department of Homeland Security to align these new requirements with those already imposed on us by other federal agencies, so long as such alignment can serve both Homeland Security and other health and safety goals. And also, we would like to ensure that whatever approach is taken to these rules, it doesn't inadvertently weaken the national security by hindering science and engineering education and research on our campuses. Let me briefly speak to the specific university concerns regarding the chemical facility anti-terrorism standard. The higher education community was surprised to discover that the list of chemicals of interest, which was published in Appendix A in April, included a number of compounds commonly found in our labs. If the rule were adopted with no further changes, it would apply virtually to every college and university, many hospitals, and certainly to some secondary schools. The final rule addresses risks posed by large chemical manufacturing and industrial facilities. It is not, in our view, well tailored to deal with the unique characteristics of colleges and universities, which have relatively small quantities of many different types of chemicals, which are dispersed over many labs in multitude of buildings. These features of universities lead to two challenges. One is the completing of the top screen as it is now designed. As I've already mentioned, the campus environment is decentralized, complex, and most importantly, dynamic. On any given day, some portion of the chemicals housed in the lab is being consumed in experiments, and another, there are new ones being acquired. We have robust systems that were developed to ensure the safe handling and disposal of the chemicals. These systems and these risk assessments do not mean require to track the day-to-day inventories. The proposed 60-day window for completing the top screen inventory doesn't provide colleges and universities sufficient lead time to collect the required information for that purpose. Secondly, our campuses may be required to undertake a vulnerability assessment and to prepare security plans. And we do expect that some universities will be asked to develop and will fall into that category. We would like to see security plans that make sense for universities which are operated differently than industrial concerns. Having expressed this concern, I also want to commend the Department of Homeland Security how it has already responded to our concerns. Specifically, the department has recently begun working closely with the college and university community to develop a strategy for securing chemicals on campuses in a reasonable and effective way. I'm pleased that the DHS has agreed to establish a working group of experts from the higher education community to consider rational and efficient strategies for inventorying and securing chemicals on our campuses consistent with the intent of the new standard. This consultation should result in a better rule which would be easier to implement, much greater compliance, and less unintended disruption of teaching and research. In conclusion, I would like again to reemphasize the colleges, universities are committed to ensuring safety and security of education and research on campuses. We are grateful to Congress and the administration who appreciate the importance of balancing security to the needs of the education and research. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I would like to welcome any questions you may have. Thank you, ma'am.
Let me thank all of the witnesses for their instructive testimony. And as I begin my questioning, we will proceed with my asking questions of each of you. If there is someone who desires to answer the question or to add to the answer or a different perspective of the witness that I've questioned, please acknowledge, and I would be happy to expand this record. This is very key to, one, the oversight that we're responsible for, but at the same time, it is a part of the instruction manual for a more extensive review of these questions of chemicals and the need for further legislative response. There have been several points that have been made here, but I do want to refresh the witnesses' memories, and as I do so, again, let me thank Mr. Scott in particular, because we know of the long history that Dow Chemical has had. It's a well-known American fixture, if you will, and it has a history of being attentive to these concerns. And so we appreciate the testimony that you've given. And as you reflect on my statements about the appreciation for your attentiveness, please also reflect on the points that I'm about to make. Chemicals are benign until they are used in an untoward manner. And so most of us would have considered fertilizer and ammonia somewhat benign prior to Timothy McVeigh. And now we look at ammonia and fertilizer and other elements and various moving trucks, I don't want to call a particular name brand, somewhat suspiciously. That is why we're in this committee room today. I take with extreme seriousness and sensitivity a thriving chemical industry. I also reflect upon what Americans are used to: freedom. Freedom to design, research, think, move goods. But unfortunately, and this statement I don't mind our enemies hearing, we have to turn more inward. We have to be more vigilant. And that is why we, if you will, established this committee to include critical infrastructure, which is well known to be predominantly in the private sector. But we are acknowledging that creativity on chemical uses outside of the chemical plant, materials that could be secured, particularly out of the universities, and we are certainly respectful of how attentive universities, some are probably becoming. But we do know that there is the very sure possibility that those who are intending to do harm can find any number of ways to use innocent products to do so. And I'd like you to answer my questions in that backdrop so that we can be constructive as we proceed. I am acknowledging that DHS is in negotiations with a great number of those who have different perspectives. I will be asking them to provide us with a briefing as they move toward any decision making. It will be very important that Congress is included in this loop, primarily because even from last week, we live in a different time. Mr. Crowley, then my question to you, as I've asked Secretary Stephan, would you expand on two aspects? One, the seam. I think that's an important point. The seam of the travel of chemicals, whether or not we have enough funding, as you perceived it, having been in government, to develop legislation along the concept of seam. Let me be very frank about jurisdictional issues. I think this should be a homeland security issue, singularly, because it relates to security. But when you think of seam, you might have jurisdictional questions, because a seam requires transportation modes. But again, if it's transportation security, it falls in this subcommittee and the Homeland Security. So the question of seam, and I don't know if you've had the opportunity to look at the regulatory scheme that we put in place, one last year's and then the appropriations language. I don't think we're finished, but whether or not there are sufficient resources, and as you've listened to the Secretary, sufficient staffing, that would give you the comfort that if you had to sit here today and say that we were moving toward securing ourselves against al-Qaeda, that you would be able to say, at the backdrop of your experience, that we're almost there, that this is the right direction, that we don't need to do anymore. Ms. Crowley?
Yes, ma'am. I would say we are moving gradually in the right direction. What concerns me is, I think, as we've reflected upon what's happening in Iraq, for example, the threat is advancing faster than we are taking steps to meaningfully reduce risk. Your comment on the seam is dead on. Right now, we're treating chemical security as one phenomenon. We're treating rail security as a separate phenomenon, and I would encourage the committee at some point to try to put those together into a comprehensive approach. Right now, on the rulemaking, for example, the process comes down to keep the stuff moving, through the system. I don't think that's adequate from a security standpoint. I absolutely what Mr. Markey said about the gap, the chlorine gap. I think that is fundamental. Chlorine, as we see, is perhaps the chemical that already is in the sights of al-Qaeda. And as I said in my testimony, if they ever get a chance to perfect what they're doing in Iraq, it'll be on the internet, it'll be available, and be an incentive for those who want to try to do something similar here. So finding ways to reduce the length of our supply chains, I think, is critical, and I think Mr. Scott and Dow have some ideas on how to best do that. I'm greatly concerned as I sit here and I listen to Colonel Stephan, and here we are in the process of initiating and implementing a regulatory framework, and he's still looking ahead to funding and personnel that he doesn't have right now. I think there is a serious question when you look at the top screen is going to capture tens of thousands of chemical facilities. In their tiering, they're likely to capture at least several thousand facilities in their tiering. And if you do the math, they have right now perhaps something like one person evaluating 1,000 facilities. That's not going to work. It appeared to me that he was talking about having different kinds of oversight based on the level of risk, but we have to make sure that those areas that are clearly performing a critical security role, that function has to be reserved for government employees, and that's not an area that I think can be effectively done by the private sector.
With non-classified speculation, what magnitude of an incident could occur with chemical plants?
Well, Madam Chairwoman, my metric in this whole thing exists right down the street from where we sit. If we eventually develop a chemical security regime that allows CSX to transport hazardous material, including TIH gases, on the rail lines, 2 of them that go through Washington, D.C., because we recognize that the Capitol, for example, was a target on 9/11. Thankfully, they weren't able to get here. But if the regime allows that to happen, then I don't think we have genuine chemical security. So that's, I think, as we go along, we have to find ways to link chemical security and what's happening in the fence line, but the regime that DHS develops must take into account and assess the risk that's posed by the transportation of chemicals between a manufacturer and a user. The highest point of risk could well be in the middle of that supply chain, and if DHS's system is driven by an assessment of risk inside the fence line without taking into account what's happening in the supply chains, then I don't think we'll end up with real chemical security.
Let me thank you, and before I go on to Mr. Scott, you mentioned Iraq, and let me mention it again, because there is an element of the lack of expertise that a layman, in quotes, maybe what is perceived to be a terrorist, a regular terrorist fighter, those terrorists that are being trained by the conditions in Iraq, which I think are well publicized and documented, that we are multiplying the number of terrorists, young terrorists, individuals that are keyed in to an incident in this country. Is there the necessity of extreme intelligence, technical training, years of experience to make something happen with toxic or explosive chemicals that have that base? Mr. Crowley, is there a need? Do you have to be vastly experienced to be able to participate in something happening?
Not
dastardly?
necessarily. I mean, the good news is that as we move down the scale from...
That's the bad news. The question was, do the terrorists have to be sophisticated, trained, knowledgeable PhDs to make something happen with chemicals?
Not at all. And the physicians in Glasgow and London that's the good news and the bad news. They weren't successful, but all they needed was a better bomb maker. But they're focused on things that are familiar to them, and they're focused on familiar targets. And what's chilling to me about Glasgow and London is they got to their intended targets. They weren't discovered by intelligence agencies or law enforcement in advance. Thankfully, their bombs didn't work. But we can't rely on that every time. But the short answer is these are highly educated people, but they're not necessarily scientists.
That leads me, thank you, Mr. Crowley. Mr. Scott, it leads me to you and to again restate my appreciation for what Dow has done as a representative of the industry, and also to go right to what I understand has been discussed by Dow as its recognition of the different levels at which different states are, their regulatory scheme is, and Dow's willingness to accept different state rules and laws. Is that still what Dow is prepared to do if there were states that had more secure regulations that your facilities were in, or that any chemical industry facility was in? Is the gist that the willingness to accept preemption?
Before I answer that question, I'd like to build on a couple of points that Mr. Crowley hit on, if I could do that.
I will, if you could just answer this one, yes or no, the preemption, are you willing to cede to some of the states that have different laws from the federal government?
We think there should be a strong enough national law, national regulation in place that the states would say that's strong enough, we don't need any more. But we recognize that there are areas where states have some special issues that they need to address, and if that's the case, we support the states' rights to put regulations in place to address those issues as long as they're not in conflict with the national regulations.
I thank you, and you may respond to some of the points that Mr. Crowley has made.
Thank you. Just a couple of points on the gaps between supply chain and site security. One of the things that we are really looking at with our integrated approach to security is just that. How do we build layers of security around critical assets on our sites and then extend those layers of security through the entire supply chain to our customers, through any routes of modes of transportation to our customers? Because what we want to try to do is build a secure line from beginning to end of the chemicals that we work with, that our nation needs. And we think that's doable. That's a manageable project if we can get our arms around it and get everybody involved in that from all aspects. So we support that, and the integration of our supply chain with our site security also allows you not to shift the risk from one area to another. You address the entire supply chain. The other piece of that is any gaps between or the options on rail and security. There are toolkits out there of a wide range of tools that we can use to improve security, whether it's supply chain or whether it's at the site security, the physical security level. And what we're supporting is the use of any one of those tools, whichever tool makes sense to make the most effective improvement in security. Thank you.
Let me pursue this line of questioning with you and note that you have been a strong part of the criminal sector coordinating council, doing a lot on trying to enhance chemical security. With that in mind, you've also been a leader on the possible broadness of these regulations, sort of having a massive sweep of facilities with small quantities or other types of facilities that may not be chemical that might have small quantities. I pose the question in a way that we're all thinking now. A small amount of a chemical in one place and a small amount in 10 other places brings together a batch that may be deadly. And so in the spirit of trying not to inconvenience, are we truly true to our commitment, which is to secure the homeland? Is there not a better way than to take these small quantities off the list? Can you expand on that? Your view that it is too expansive and the regulations are drawing in some that do not need to be drawn in, but one small batch can be multiplied with other small batches. We're talking about the potential of terrorists who will use all means of creativity to do harm to this nation. Mr. Scott?
We think that DHS is taking a risk-based approach. The top screen and the CSAT are taking risk-based approaches. And as far as the levels, the amounts of product or chemicals that are involved in Appendix A, we haven't seen the final list yet, so we don't really know what's there. But we believe that any facility, regardless whether it's a chemical manufacturing facility or a very small facility that has a high risk of theft or diversion, off-site impact, or anything that can be weaponized, should be included in the regulations.
What is your opinion about sunset?
The sunset, I believe, sets up a very perceived deadlines that rush the process or seem to rush the process, and we've seen a couple of cases not just with DHS, but in other areas where when you rush to a solution, you don't get the most effective solution. So sunset, we think, just puts in some arbitrary or perceived deadlines, and we'd like to see DHS be given the amount of time that's needed to effectively implement the implementation. We think they've taken significant steps in the right direction. We want to let them continue on down that path.
We thank you for that. That's some issue that we're going to look at very closely.
Thank you. As
to whether or not the sunset works for us or against us. I know that you are here with a very strong handle on the industry and a very strong sensitivity to the industry. Do you think we have a lot more work to do? Not every holder of chemicals is a Dow Chemical. And so I think it's important for Congress to hear it straight. We have a lot of work to do. Chemicals are held in many, many different facilities. Again, I've asked this question to each of the witnesses so far. Your opinion on that, please.
We've pushed very strongly for legislation just for that reason. We think there are a lot of companies out there and a lot of associations that have taken a leadership position and put in voluntary security upgrades at their sites in the supply chain and done this on a voluntary basis. But we thought the need for regulation was there, and we've supported that because we need to get a lot of other players involved that need to be involved in the process.
Thank you very much. Mr. Alexander, your employees are on the front line beyond the issue of security. Over the years, we have seen, coming from my part of the world, chemical accidents, explosions, loss of life. You've mentioned your concern about the tiered risk system. Everybody's at risk. You want to explain that further? You have your mic on.
Sorry. In the regulations here, when it talks about high risk versus low risk or other tiers, it identifies what a list of issues that have to be addressed for a high-risk facility, and it insinuates, it doesn't say what would have to be done for the lower risk, but it insinuates that it would be a different list depending on the associated risk. And our opinion is that the issues that are listed in there are issues that should be addressed at every facility, whether it's a high risk or low risk. If you're going to say that because it's a high risk, you need to follow that list that's in there. And if you did follow it, and if that did deter someone from being a terrorist and using that as a facility for threat, then why not go to a lower risk one and do the same thing if it doesn't have the security? So what we're saying is there shouldn't be a differentiation between any of them. They're all risks. They're risks to the workers, they're risks to the communities. And what we all know for the people that are dealing with the chemicals is even a low-risk facility can have catastrophic events if the people, the terrorists were to act in a way such that it would cause a catastrophic event. So we feel that it should be the same. The one thing that we disagree with on that list is the background checks. Background checks for people that you're hiring, we understand, and any company that uses any good sense would have background checks before they hire someone. But background checks, what we've seen in former Department of Homeland Security regulation that was passed, have been misused against workers who are actually already at the site, been working for years. And in the Maritime and Department of Transportation, they've had to add more provisions where if a person is accused of or been found to have a felony within a 7-year period, and now they're a terrorist threat and the company has a right to fire them because of that, they've added provisions so that they can appeal that decision. In this regulation, there's no way to appeal it or anything else. So if a company wanted to target a particular worker and dismiss them for obviously other reasons, and they could do that, then it can happen, and it has happened. It happened in the maintenance of way, and that's one of the reasons why they had to add those provisions. And so we don't understand why those provisions aren't in this one.
But let me first of all say, Mr. Alexander, we've faced this issue before. We faced this issue with the Department of Homeland Security. You're raising this as we look to a more comprehensive approach, even though we've had 2 bites at the apple on chemical security is one that we will take under advisement. And I think it should be clear that you're not suggesting that we do away with background checks. You're suggesting that in the background checks, it should not be used as a basis for terminating individuals who've been there and working and very much a part of the particular company and may have something in their background that has nothing to do with their propensity toward terrorist acts. And that's something that we want to be aware of. Let me ask you just two more quick questions. Would more employee training, as we have looked to do in other critical infrastructure industries, be helpful as well, that there be a requirement that the workers be engaged in thwarting potential terrorist acts or what to do, but basic worker training as it relates to security in these plants?
Absolutely. We feel that the workers should be involved in every aspect, including training if there is an attack. You have to know how to shut the process down, how to deal with it. If you have an attack that causes chemicals to be released, what are you going to do with the rest of the process? Is the whole thing going to go up? Training with the workers of how to deal, and you only have minutes. We have some provisions in the law under emergency response at this particular time that gave a loophole, so to speak, to companies that didn't have to train workers, where they could count on services from outside the plant. And what we have found is what's most critical is the time. Whenever you have an incident, you have to act as quickly as possible. And by training the workers and having people on site that know how to deal with that would certainly reduce an event from being as catastrophic as it could be.
Training. You mentioned safer technology, and you seem to suggest that other than establishing the risk-based strategy, we don't have anything that encourages these companies to go out and buy, go out and seek, go out and investigate safer technologies. Is that the point you're making?
The point that I was making on safer technologies, there's nothing in this regulation that either requires or recommends a company to seek safer technologies. And even though it may result in a benefit to the company by doing so that might take them off of a risk, there's nothing here that says it. One of the easiest ways to eliminate the chemicals, not that you could do it all of them, but chemicals from being transported, for instance, chlorine. Chlorine's the easiest example and probably the most likely chemical that someone's going to try to use. And I think that's why you're seeing it coming up missing now, is don't use it. And there are plenty of substitutions for chlorine that can be used. But when the first thing that Mr. Crowley talked about, I don't know, one of the things he talked about was the water treatment plants being exempt, and Mr. Markey talked about them. That's where the chlorine's at, and they're exempt, and they have the ability to use substitution chemicals that would not be nearly as dangerous or even comparable to using chlorine. So why they're not part of this regulation is a really good question, and why isn't this regulation encouraging, or recommending, at least if not requiring, companies to seek out inherently safer technology, not just the substitution of chemicals, but the process itself, the mechanical process that they're using. We have ways of protecting the facilities better than what they're being protected now.
Mr. Crowley, quickly, does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. I mean, I don't think that it's for the federal government to dictate a specific solution to any chemical manufacturer or user, but if in the process you now have inherently safer and secure alternatives as part of that process, as one tool, then what it will do is it will dramatically reduce our level of vulnerability, and then we can deal with those residual chemicals and processes that don't lend themselves to an alternative, through an effective means. But certainly, in the research that we've done, we've clearly shown that there are viable and affordable alternatives out there. We've surveyed a number of facilities. Some of them are changing, but many are not. and there's just this inertia that I think the regulatory process can help with, and many facilities can convert from a existing dangerous, inherently dangerous process that can be exploited by a terrorist to a safer alternative at modest cost.
Mr. Alexander, Mr.
If I
Scott.
could add to that, please, I would like to point out, we'd also support, as one of the many tools that you have in your toolkit, inherently safer technology, both in process design and product use. But just for the record, I'd also point out that chlorine does account for, is used in 93% of all pharmaceuticals, 25% of all medical plastics, and 86% of crop protection chemicals. It is a basic building block for many of the things that are in our culture today.
Is that chlorine?
Chlorine.
And which means the import of your statement would make it difficult to remove.
There are opportunities for use of inherently safer technology, but chlorine is a basic building block for everything we use in our world today.
Mr. Alexander, I've asked everyone else, do you think we're made any progress in being safer as it relates to chemical plants, as it relates to your employees who are many times employed by these companies?
Well, I think we're making progress. There's no doubt we're making progress, and I was happy to see some of the suggestions that we made earlier on were adopted in this regulation. But there's certainly some things that we need to consider along the way of how they may adversely affect other situations, like, for instance, the workers in the workplace. You know, if you create a law that's going to take away rights of workers and rights of the community for right to know and the ability for their representatives to investigate and protect the workers, then we're creating a problem where there was none before. So we just ask that we carefully consider and put some stipulations in here. The original stuff that was written where it basically said they would not just preempt state law, the original stipulation said they would preempt any law. That's the exact words that were written in there. And we can't allow a knee-jerk reaction to ignore what we have fought for years and years for rights for workers in the community to try to protect our facilities. Not that we shouldn't protect our facilities, but we need to be careful that we don't take away other rights that will endanger community and workers. So by taking away those rights, then you have an adverse effect. So we need to just be careful. We're all about moving forward and making the facilities safer and less of a threat. There's no doubt about that, but we just need to be careful how we move forward to make sure that we don't cause an adverse effect.
Well, let me I acknowledge the work that we have still to do and the components that each of you represent, and particularly employees that are either on the front line of safety or on the front line of security are key to what we are trying to accomplish here. And so your continued involvement would be welcomed. Mr. Tahmassian, let me thank you for representing the university community. The last thing we want to do is to stifle research and development, which is the cutting edge of the nation's economy. But I'm reminded, frankly, of, again, without being redundant, of the climate in which we live. It has been recently publicized that terrorist cells are in the United States. Cells, by their very definition, may be one person or two persons. They may be 10 persons. But we do know that they are, by the definition of cell, nuclear, able to move around, small. That means that university campuses can be vulnerable. And so I would welcome your explanation as to why, if we found a way to manage the universities, know that you are on a particular budget, that universities should not be included. And my second question is that large universities are probably more susceptible to resources to do what you've just suggested, Boston University. But we have thousands upon thousands of colleges and universities who have chem labs and are handling various chemicals. What is our response to them?
Madam Chairwoman, we're really not asking to be completely excluded. What we're asking is a process by which the standard is sort of adopted to the different environment of the universities. If you look at the universities, and again, we're going by the first version of the Appendix A that we saw. To obtain the 2,000 pound, to be very specific, and I can give you an illustrative example, nitric acid, which is very commonly used in almost every chemistry lab and almost every biology lab, has a threshold of 2,000 pounds. If you roughly assume that 1 gallon is equivalent of 10 pounds, and majority of the labs in a university environment at most will have 1 gallon of it. That means to obtain that 2,000 or to hit the 2,000 pound threshold, you literally have to go to something between 200 and 220 labs, which might be in 20 different buildings, to reach that threshold. So what we're really looking at is how do we define those kind of thresholds that make sense for the university environment, rather than saying that we want umbrella exclusion. I don't know if that answers the question.
If I'm hearing you, you're saying that do not exclude, but be responsible to the prototype of a university and what it means and how much the quantity that you would have.
That's correct.
In the regulations, then, would you welcome defined regulations that might single out the university and college community so that there would be requirements, but they would be requirements that would be responsible to the business that you're in?
Yes.
One of the things that is distinctive is that we don't do background checks on students. And the campus is the bastion of freedom of expression. And so there lies all kinds of speculation. Who would have ever thought in the series of London bombings in Scotland that caregivers, medical professionals would be involved? No one has yet reported whether or not that materials that they found, and I don't know if the nexus has been made, was connected to their profession. But certainly in a hospital, you are very much part of having access to chemicals, and certainly hospitals are on our list for critical infrastructure and concerns that we'll be raising as they care for those who are in need. But if that be the case, then we will want to work as carefully as we can. But why don't you respond to just the broad point that I've made about students and lack of background checks? Mr. Alexander said he has no problem with background checks. He just doesn't want it to be used against long-standing employees, and we've had that issue before. We're going to work with them. But what is your level of protection? Professors and others, very difficult with this whole idea of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, which is where this is supposed to occur.
Yeah, the issue of background checks in the university overall for employees is not new. We do background checks on a number of what we consider sensitive. For example, many of people who currently work with finances and if they're handling cash, including at the hospital, they are subject to background checks. I think the question of the students is a little bit more complicated because, as you indicated, we have not been in the business of background checks from a criminal perspective of the students. However, when the students are on the campuses, majority of the campuses do have programs where the faculty, the professors, the teaching assistants are actually now trained in looking for certain behavioral patterns and see if there are things which are unusual. And these are not necessarily just from a, sort of looking for terrorism. That's not what I'm implying, is that if there are behavioral changes that we think student might be having difficulties, it's depressed. And these are brought up to the attention of the university officials who have appointed actually social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists that will talk to the students and try to monitor them. I think that if we could work within a framework such as that, we might be able to come up with a solution that meets the security requirements as well as the university.
Well, I don't want the pronouncement out of this hearing that the committee has decided to background check all of the nation's students. But I do want to express a concern to you about those who are the caretakers of labs, researchers, faculty, again, not stifling educational freedom, but this is the kind of microscope that we have to begin to look at America, not to stifle thought and stifle research, but to be currently aware that we live in a world where al-Qaeda is not isolated, it is franchised, and it moves around, and it may be in places where we would least expect it. So when we look at a comprehensive approach, that's why you're here today, because we want it to be sensible, responsible, but serious. And the last word, of course, is comprehensive. Yes. I would encourage you to look back on your whole university council and the issues that I've just raised. Even though small amounts may be at these various chemical labs and research components of universities, they might not have to go to 200 universities to secure what they need. It might be one university or a series of universities, and that's not a difficult task. Let me thank you for your testimony. I'm going to conclude, Mr. Crowley, and let me just, Mr. Tahmassian, I've asked everybody the question of how secure you feel we are with our efforts toward chemical security, and particularly as it relates to universities.
I think we have made significant progress over the last 6 or 7 years. 7 years ago, nobody thought about security the way we're thinking about now. Most of our security was securing the environment for our faculty and our students so their personal belongings doesn't get stolen, so they don't get attacked and so on. Today, actually, as you walk into the facility, name badges are displayed by everyone. People challenge you if they don't recognize you in the lab. We have made a fair amount of progress. Obviously, like anything else, there's a lot more to be done, and we need to continuously be vigilant and look at how better we can perform than we have done in the past.
Let me thank you very much for that assessment. It gives us a broad view. Mr. Crowley, the end is going to be beholden to you. Are we at a crisis? We are reading the national intelligence estimates, some of which have been publicized, so that we are speaking from what we have, those who are here. I will speak to what has been in the newspaper. The national intelligence estimates has, as I've characterized, indicated that al-Qaeda is moving around, that it's franchised. This committee has an enormous responsibility to address the question. We're in the 9/11 conference trying to meet some of the requirements, such as the screening 100% of cargo, which is part of your SEAM. And of course, there's opposition to that. Do we have any latitude of being lax on ensuring a very pronounced regulatory comprehensive process for chemical security?
Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, I think the crisis, if we have it, is one of focus. I mean, obviously, the longer we get from 9/11, the good news is we haven't been attacked, but we are becoming complacent. I think that is probably the greatest thing that we have to overcome. And you know, Dr. Tahmassian earlier mentioned the fact that through this process that we have started with chemical security, they now recognize that they are part of this. They did not expect that they would be so many universities would be captured by the preliminary list that DHS puts out. And I think that's exactly the process that we should be having here. That all entities across, I mean, and there's a wide latitude in terms of what we consider to be a chemical facility. There's a full range of activities here. But certainly, the process is beginning to help various companies and entities recognize that they have to be part of this security equation. And I think what the good news about this top screen is it begins a process, it begins a dialogue with perhaps some entities that did not see themselves as part of this security equation. So I think the bad news here is that we're becoming complacent. We've bought into some rhetoric that's been used in political realm that we're fighting them over here so we don't have to confront them here, or fight them over there so we don't have to confront them here. The reality of what we saw in Glasgow and Scotland is we are likely to confront them here, and we may not have the intelligence that tells us where they are, and so that we can stop them in advance, so that we have to rely on processes like this one, and then through that process you begin a dialogue so that you can get at the heart of the security concern and address that, establish positive responsibility by various entities that have possession of dangerous chemicals, and establish a process where we can, over time, significantly reduce this risk.
Let me thank the witnesses very much for their testimony. Mr. Crowley, Mr. Scott, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Tahmassian, let me thank you very much. You have given us a roadmap. The other part of the seam that Mr. Crowley speaks to is the whole idea of intelligence. And that is certainly a responsibility of this committee, another subcommittee, having the intelligence to be preventative. But at the same time, as we glean intelligence, if for one moment our intelligence slips, which all of it is based on human opportunities and abilities, then we must have, on the other hand, a high barrier, very high mountain of prevention. I am not in any way satisfied that as we sit here today, we have covered or are beginning to cover, though I think we're making great steps. And I'm very appreciative of the sectors who on their own account have sought DHS. They are to be applauded. But there are human elements to that. There are human interests. There's interests that are all involved. So I am not convinced, as the chairperson of this committee, that we have frankly reached the vastness of where we need to go. I've heard the word tens of thousands. So that means that we have the able representation of Mr. Scott, very able, and the presence of the council here. But beyond that, there are tens of thousands handling chemicals in America, unsupervised, unwatched, and certainly not ready to face what potentially may be a terrorist incident. This overview is to engage each and every one of you. We will not do it in a vacuum. We need to do it quickly. I don't think what is done is enough, and it does not in any way give me comfort that we could not foresee in days or weeks ahead someone taking license, unfortunately, in the climate that we're in. That's our responsibility, to be able to stand up and say that we've done all that we could to prevent a horrific incident that could be reflected through the words of Mr. Markey and his comments about chlorine, and respecting Mr. Scott's retort on that, but also any number of chemicals. I'm not satisfied that our employees who are handling chemicals outside of the industry are trained. I believe we need more monies for surrounding neighborhoods, some of the greatest victims or vulnerable persons as relates to the use of chemicals in a terrorist act. And certainly some of the nuances that have been said, fairness with background checks, responding to the universities, responding to the chemical industry is all in place. But as we leave this room, the question is, have we done what we need to do to not read a headline this week, the next week, and the next week? Your testimony will help us move to that point, I hope. But for me, we're not moving fast enough. So I thank you all very much for your testimony and your presence here today. It has been constructive and instructive, and I hope that we will be able, as a committee and a department, work together. Let me finalize by saying the members are in different places. There are legislation on the floor, any number of committees, because we're nearing a point of a recess, work recess. So I do want to say on behalf of the members that they will submit their statements into the record. They appreciate the testimony. The ranking member was called off to a meeting. Likewise, I appreciate your testimony, and we work together on this committee in a bipartisan manner, and I hope that we will have that opportunity to do that in the name of the American people, to step in front of, if we possibly can, any potential incident as a result of the oversight of our particular committee. Thank you all. This hearing has now come to a close. Any further statements will be submitted into the record.